Have you ever seen a play so absurd that for a few seconds you simply couldn't tell if you were witnessing pure genius or something completely wrong? Millions were watching live. It was a high-stakes table, cameras positioned at every angle, cards revealed to the audience, commentators analyzing every move. It was another official poker broadcast, one of those that transforms a simple cash game into a global spectacle. The pot was already gigantic. The tension was palpable, and then came the decision. A call, inexplicable, uncomfortable, almost impossible. The commentators were silent for a second. Then they started laughing, as if it were just a move too daring for conservative minds. But the expressions on the players' faces at the table told a different story. It didn't just seem like strategic creativity. It seemed strange. No professional player could explain that decision. And we're talking about people accustomed to million-dollar bluffs, historic hero calls, and surgical psychological reads. In the world of live-streamed high-stakes poker, unconventional decisions happen. It's part of the game. But that went beyond the realm of the improbable. Either it was the most absurd reading in history, or something very wrong happened. And this is where the conflict begins. In poker, especially in official games with live streaming, every detail matters. Timing tells, betting frequency, mathematical patterns. Nothing goes unnoticed by those who truly understand. When a play completely defies the logic of odds, ranges, and even basic human intuition, the entire community goes on alert. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling of watching something and thinking, it can't have been just luck. Well, that's exactly the feeling that gripped those who watched. Within minutes, the clips began circulating on social media. Specialized forums exploded. Theories emerged almost instantly. Cheating? Insider information? Some kind of unauthorized access to the broadcast? Or simply a psychological interpretation from another planet? What you are about to discover may surprise you. Because in poker, with scandals, suspicions, and potential cheating, the line between genius and fraud is extremely thin. And when there's a live broadcast, with cards revealed to the public in real time, the possibilities and the paranoia increase even further. The decision was made in seconds, but the consequences reverberated for weeks. The opponent seemed shocked. Part of the table looked uncomfortable. The internet was divided. Some argued that it was pure instinct, a perfect emotional reading. Others claimed that statistically that play didn't hold up, and the more experts analyzed it, the less consensus there was. Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about a poker hand. It's about trust. It's about big money. It's about reputation in high-stakes games broadcast live to the entire world. And above all, it's about the exact moment when a play stops being admired and starts being questioned. Was it supernatural skill or blatant cheating? The answer isn't as simple as it seems. And to understand why this play became one of the most suspicious ever seen in an official poker broadcast, we need to go back a few minutes before that decision, when the atmosphere at the table was already beginning to indicate that something different was about to happen. Because even before that decision that brought the table to a standstill, there was already a different atmosphere in the air. Small details that, at the time, went unnoticed by almost everyone. A prolonged look, an unusual reaction time, a betting pattern that didn't match the strategy adopted until then. Subtle things. But in live-streamed high-stakes poker, nothing is truly small. Anyone who follows scandals and suspicions in official games knows that many stories begin exactly like this, with something seemingly irrelevant. And that's why this case stirred the community so much. It wasn't just a strange play. It was the entire context that transformed that moment into one of the most debated scenes in modern poker. Perhaps you've experienced something similar at a smaller table. That hand where everything seemed wrong. That feeling that your opponent knew more than they should. Or maybe you're on the other side, believing it was just a brilliant read, one of those that only comes along once in a lifetime. And it's precisely this division that makes it all the more fascinating. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this story so far. Are you on the "that was brilliant" team or the "something's wrong here" team? Your opinion truly matters because poker has always been built on debate, analysis, and the clash of ideas. And when you comment, you're not just interacting, you're helping to build this conversation. And if you enjoy diving into the behind-the-scenes world of poker, with scandals, suspicions, and inexplicable decisions in live streams, be sure to like the video. It may seem simple, but this shows the platform that this type of content deserves to reach more people who also love the game and want to understand what really happens behind the scenes. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and continue bringing investigations, analyses, and stories that go beyond the cards on the table. And if you're not yet subscribed, perhaps now is the time to become part of this community that questions, analyzes, and doesn't accept everything superficially. Because here, we don't just look at the outcome of the hand, we look at what might be hidden behind it. Now, with that in mind, come back with me to that table. The pot was already overflowing. The cards revealed to the audience created an almost uncomfortable tension, and the further the hand progressed, the clearer it became that this decision hadn't come out of nowhere. Something was happening even before the final card touched the felt. That wasn't your average Friday night table. It wasn't a regional tournament, nor a cash game tucked away in the back of some casino. It was a high-stakes cash game broadcast live, with professional production, high-definition cameras, cards displayed in real time to the audience, and thousands, maybe millions, of people following every move as if it were a world championship final. The scene was impeccable. Focused lighting, chips arranged in stacks that resembled small towers of financial concrete, microphones capturing every heavy breath. Behind the scenes, a technical team controlled the transmission delay, commentators analyzed ranges and probabilities, and on social media, the chat was already buzzing even before the first card was dealt. And the amount involved was not symbolic. We're talking about pots that easily exceeded hundreds of thousands of dollars. In some hands, the amount approached figures that changed the trajectory of a life. Enough money to buy houses, start businesses, completely transform a reality. This is not just a card game. It's an environment where decisions carry real, immediate, and irreversible impact. At that particular table, there was a dangerous mix. Experienced professionals accustomed to playing under extreme pressure, well-known figures in the community, recreational entrepreneurs with almost unlimited bankrolls, and personalities who already had a history of participating in live streams. People who understood image, reputation, and competitive mindset. This matters a lot. Because when you put professionals who make a living from gambling alongside recreational players with a lot of money and little patience for losing, emotional balance becomes part of the equation. Every bet isn't just math, it's psychology, ego, body language, internal transformation happening in real time. There, every movement was being analyzed under a collective microscope. It wasn't just about winning chips, it was about how you won. It was about how you positioned yourself in front of the cameras. It was about the narrative that would be built afterward. In live broadcasts, what goes on behind the scenes is just as relevant as what appears on the table. The hidden truth is often in the subtext, in the way someone looks at the dealer, in the time it takes to push the chips, in the breathing that changes when the pot grows beyond what is comfortable. And the pot in that particular hand began to grow early. The dynamics at the table were already intense. Some previous hands had been aggressive, frequent three bets, exposed bluffs, uncomfortable calls. The atmosphere wasn't cordial, it was one of constant testing. Who gives in first? Who shows weakness? Who is willing to cross the line of maximum risk? When there's so much money at stake, any strange decision becomes suspicious. This statement is not an exaggeration. It's a natural reflex of the human mind when faced with high stakes. Pressure alters perception. And when there's a live broadcast, that pressure is amplified by an invisible audience that judges every choice. Even before the controversial play occurred, there was already a context fueling the tension. One of the players had been adopting an aggressive line outside his usual pattern. Another seemed visibly uncomfortable after losing a large pot minutes earlier. Small signs that in isolation mean nothing, but together, they begin to form a pattern. And patterns are everything in poker. Anyone who understands the game knows that decisions rarely come out of nowhere. They are the result of an internal journey that involves reading behavior, calculating probabilities, and often a momentary shift in mindset. But there, at that table, something seemed out of alignment, as if the pieces weren't fitting together in the traditional way. The audience at home had access to the cards. This completely changes the experience. You watch knowing who's ahead, who's bluffing, who's mathematically crushed. And when a player makes a decision that completely defies the logic of the available information, the feeling of strangeness is almost inevitable. The hand began seemingly normally. Bets were in line with the table's pattern. Re-raises were consistent with recent history, but as the community cards were revealed, the narrative of the hand began to become unsettling. The possible combinations didn't favor a heroic decision. The blockers didn't justify such a wide call. The math seemed to scream one thing, while the action indicated another, and it is at this point that context becomes essential. Because it wasn't just an isolated decision. It was a decision made in a high-profile environment, with enough money to generate instant distrust, with players experienced enough to recognize strategic inconsistencies. When someone completely breaks with technical expectations in such a scenario, the impact is significant. It reverberates. The table fell silent for a second longer than usual, the kind of silence that doesn't show up in the statistics, but that every player feels. The energy shifts, the emotional reading changes, the atmosphere becomes heavy, and, perhaps most importantly, collective perception changes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the financial value and psychological pressure is only the tip of the iceberg. There's an even more complex layer involving reputation, live streaming, trust in the system, and the potential loopholes that almost no one notices when they're just watching for entertainment. But before we get into that more delicate part, I want to know something simple from you. When money increases, do you believe people play fairer, or that temptation grows along with it? Comment below. This makes sense to me. The question hung in the air, but the table had no time for philosophy. The cards were already in the air, sliding across the green felt as if nothing was about to happen. Pre-flop, the action started relatively standard for that level. A consistent raise from middle position. It wasn't small, it wasn't exaggerated. A typical sizing of someone who wants to build a pot without revealing extreme strength. On the other side, almost without hesitation, came the call. Silent, controlled, neutral expression. Up to that point, nothing had gone off script. The flop opened up interesting possibilities. Two connected medium cards and a high card that completely changed the texture of the table. There were possible draws. There were pairs gaining strength. There were plausible bluffs. The initial aggressor continued to show strength with a calculated C-bet. It wasn't too big. It was enough to maintain pressure and make anyone chasing something expensive. The call came again. And this is where the discomfort begins. Because the pattern of that hand no longer perfectly matched the recent history of the player who was calling. He hadn't been defending so broadly. He hadn't been calling out of position with such ease. But there he was, holding the hand as if he had absolute conviction. The turn fell. A card that, statistically, favored the initial aggressor's range much more than the range of someone who only called pre-flop and flop. It was the type of card that closes out some strong combinations and weakens several draws. The bet came in bigger now. Real pressure. Pot growing. Tension rising. The tank ride was longer this time. Cameras focused. Partial silence in the broadcast. The commentator began to question whether that previous call hadn't been too optimistic. And yet, the chips were pushed back to the center. Call. No raise. No dramatic hesitation. Just a call that didn't quite fit the math of the moment. The odds didn't make sense. When the river came, the scenario became even stranger. A seemingly irrelevant card, one that didn't complete the most obvious draws. It didn't drastically change the texture, but it consolidated the advantage of whoever had been betting heavily from the start. The initial aggressor took a deep breath and announced all in. A heavy shove, confident, like someone who knows they're representing the top of their range. Now, pause. That was the decision. On the other end, the expression didn't betray panic. There was no visible sweat. There was no conversation. Just a fixed gaze on the table. A few seconds that felt like minutes. And then, the call came. A call with a hand that, under normal circumstances, would be crushed against almost the entire value range of the opponent. No solver would recommend this. From a purely technical standpoint, that decision bordered on the absurd. It wasn't a classic hero call against an obvious bluff. It wasn't a reading based on a deep history of excessive aggression. It was a decision that ignored probabilities, ignored patterns, ignored established strategic logic. It was virtually impossible to justify that decision. And when the cards were revealed, the shock was instant. The player who called was right. He was correct. The opponent was bluffing. But it wasn't an obvious bluff. It was a credible bluff, built up over every street with strategic coherence. The mathematician said fold. The narrative on the hand said fold. Recent history suggested fold. But the call came anyway. And this is where the transformation of the story begins. Because when someone defies logic and gets it right, two possibilities arise: extraordinary genius or access to information that no one else had. The impact was immediate. At the table, the looks shifted. One of the players tilted his head slightly, as if trying to mentally recalculate everything that had happened. The bluffer opponent was visibly confused. Not indignant, confused, as if trying to understand what red could have been so accurate. Behind the scenes of the broadcast, the production maintained a professional stance. But on social media, the edits began circulating within minutes. Analysts paused the video frame by frame. Strategy experts calculated frequencies. Experienced players offered differing opinions. Because it's one thing to be wrong due to overconfidence, it's quite another to be right against all apparent odds. When you study competitive poker, you learn that decisions are based on available information. Body language, hand history, betting patterns. But there, in that specific moment, the decisions seemed to transcend all of that, as if there were a hidden truth beneath the surface of the game. The journey of that hand ceased to be merely technical. It became psychological. It became investigative. It became almost philosophical. To what extent can a player's mindset justify such an unconventional call? To what extent does confidence turn into recklessness? And at what point does suspicion cease to be paranoia and become legitimate questioning? The atmosphere in the community changed in a matter of hours. Slow-motion video clips analyzed, discussions about possible access to external information, theories about glitches in the live broadcast, questions about the integrity of the system. What was once just entertainment has turned into a debate about trust and transparency. And it was at that moment that the internet exploded. But this explosion didn't happen simply because of an unlikely call. It happened because, when we look closer, we begin to realize that perhaps that hand wasn't isolated. Perhaps there were small signs beforehand, small patterns, small previous decisions that, added together, created an even more unsettling narrative. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because analyzing the play itself is only the tip of the iceberg. When we start connecting the behind-the-scenes details, the player's previous behavior, and the impact it had on the community, the story takes on a completely different dimension. Write this down. There's something strange about this. From that moment on, the hand ceased to be just a bold decision in a high-stakes cash game. It became a phenomenon, a watershed moment. One of those episodes that transforms an isolated play into an avalanche of questions about behind-the-scenes dealings, integrity, and hidden truths. The first to react were precisely those who make a living from the game. Professionals accustomed to analyzing complex hands, champions of major tournaments, players who have faced maximum pressure at televised final tables. Within hours, videos began to emerge with strong titles, impactful thumbnails, and expressions of disbelief. Some watched the replay in slow motion, pausing each movement, observing the timing of the call, the gaze, the breathing, the way the chips were pushed. Others opened simulation software to run that specific situation dozens, hundreds of times. The result was almost unanimous in the technical field. No solver would recommend that with any significant frequency. World champions said they'd never seen anything like it. And that wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a genuine reaction from people who have seen it all in modern poker. People who have witnessed insane bluffs, historic hero calls, emotional breakdowns, and live mental transformations. Even so, that hand seemed to belong to another category. But the most interesting thing wasn't the technical unanimity. It was the emotional division. This narrative is captivating because it transforms the moment into something almost mythical. The idea that someone can access such a refined level of perception that they ignore mathematics and still get it right. It's the story of genius versus statistics. But there was another side to it, and he was noisy. Experienced players began to raise more unsettling hypotheses. Insider information? Some kind of leak during the broadcast? Hidden electronic device? External communication? The mere possibility of these questions was enough to generate a huge impact. Paper clips circulated with exaggerated zoom into pockets, hands, and discrete movements. People analyzed whether there was any suspicious vibration, an unusual exchange of glances, or any gesture that could indicate an external signal. The collective imagination went into investigative mode. In specialized forums, gigantic threads sprang up almost instantly. Each user brought their theory. Some performed in-depth mathematical analyses, dismantling the logic of the call street by street. Others focused on the player's prior behavior throughout the session, searching for patterns that would reinforce or weaken the theory of genius. And this is where things take on an even more interesting dimension. Because when the discussion leaves the table and enters the community, it ceases to be merely technical. It becomes narrative. It becomes reputation. It becomes public judgment. The transformation is rapid. In a few hours, someone can go from hero to suspect, from daring to investigated. The emotional impact of this is enormous. Respected professionals began to take a stand. Some advocated caution. Others openly stated that the move was impossible to justify within normal parameters. The word impossible began to appear with uncomfortable frequency. And the more the debate grew, the more confidence in live streaming was questioned. Because there's a silent truth in this universe. Live-streamed poker depends on credibility. It depends on the belief that the system is secure, that the cards revealed to the public aren't being accessed by anyone at the table, that the backstage operations are unobtrusive. If that trust is shaken, the damage isn't just to one player, it's to the entire ecosystem. Theories about a possible information leak began to circulate. Was the transmission delay sufficient? Could someone have had early access to the letters? Was there a technical failure? These questions, even without concrete evidence, gained traction because the context fueled doubt. And the more analyses were done, the more evident the division became. On one side, there were those who saw it as a historic play, the result of an aggressive mindset and refined emotional reading. On the other, there were those who saw a pattern incompatible with human decisions under extreme pressure. It wasn't just a strategic debate. It was almost a battle of visions about what is possible within the game. This division created something rare, an entire community debating not just one hand, but the limits of human ability versus the possibility of external interference. Behind the scenes, rumors began to surface about private conversations, internal analyses, and requests for clarification. Nothing officially conclusive at that time, but enough to keep the matter alive. And when a matter remains alive for too long, it ceases to be just controversy and becomes an informal collective investigation. What's most intriguing is that the more time passed, the less simple the story seemed. Small details previously handled began to be re-evaluated. Decisions that weren't discussed in that same session began to be revisited under new lenses. The journey of that broadcast was practically reconstructed second by second. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of all, how a single decision can trigger a complete transformation in public perception. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because theories are only the surface of what was really at stake. When we start looking behind the scenes, at the private reactions and the silent impact this had on the careers of those involved, the narrative gains layers that almost no one notices at first glance. Write this down. I don't buy that story easily. From the moment the discussion moved beyond the emotional realm and into the territory of concrete hypotheses, The debate gained new weight. It was no longer just about opinion. It was about what could really have happened there. And when you start to look at it objectively, you realize that some possibilities are more plausible than others, even though none of them are simple. The first hypothesis, the most comfortable for those who love the game, is that of extreme psychological reading. The idea that the player perceived something invisible to the public, a micro tremor in the voice, a subtle breathing pattern, a different timing in the bet, something that doesn't appear in the statistics, but which over years of playing at the tables transforms into a refined instinct. Some argue that extraordinary decisions are born precisely from this internal transformation, from a mindset that trusts its own perception above cold mathematics. But when this hypothesis is put under scrutiny, difficult questions arise, because even great psychological analyses tend to respect certain strategic limits. Even the most creative players in the world don't usually completely ignore the logical structure of ranges and probabilities. Genius in poker usually has a solid mathematical foundation behind it, and in that specific hand, that foundation seemed too fragile. The second hypothesis involves a technical failure, some kind of vulnerability in the live streaming system. Not necessarily an elaborate scheme, but a loophole, insufficient delay, unauthorized access to card information. This possibility gained traction because streamed poker depends on technology, and where there is technology, there is risk. Reports began to emerge that the production team had reviewed internal procedures, checking protocols, conducting safety assessments. At that initial stage, there was no public confirmation of any structural irregularity, but the mere fact of investigating already demonstrated that the impact had gone beyond the realm of casual speculation. The third hypothesis, the most explosive, involved external access to information. Electronic devices, indirect communication, discrete signals. This narrative gained traction on social media because it presents a clear villain, a story of obscure backstage dealings, of hidden truths waiting to be revealed. But it is also the most difficult to prove. And in the real world, accusations without concrete evidence carry profound consequences. Yes, there were formal inquiries. Yes, there were private conversations. Yes, there were more detailed technical analyses. Some people close to the production stated that there was no evidence of a system intrusion. Others maintained a cautious stance, saying that absence of proof is not proof of absence. And that phrase sums up well the atmosphere that prevailed. There was no immediate punishment. There was no official announcement declaring confirmed cheating, nor was there a definitive verdict that completely closed the matter. What happened was something perhaps even more powerful: permanent doubt. And doubt, in this context, is fuel. Because poker thrives on trust. It thrives on the belief that, despite the aggression, the bluffs, and the bold decisions, the game is clean within the established rules. When that trust is damaged, even slightly, the impact goes beyond a single hand. It affects reputations, contracts, future broadcasts, the very collective mentality of the community. For some, that play will always be remembered as one of the bravest reads ever made in a live broadcast. For others, it will be a permanent question mark, a shadow that's hard to ignore. And perhaps the truth lies somewhere between those two perceptions. What's most intriguing is realizing how a single decision can trigger such a profound transformation in the debate about integrity in modern poker. How a moment of just a few seconds can generate months of analysis, theories, partial revelations, and reflections on human and technological limitations. And here enters a broader reflection. In poker, information is power. And when millions are at stake, the line between genius and cheating becomes very thin. This line isn't drawn with clear ink. It's built with context, perception, narrative, and trust. And the higher the level of the game, the more delicate this boundary becomes. That night's decision continues to be analyzed from different angles, as if each replay could reveal something that still went unnoticed. Perhaps it was an absurd interpretation. Perhaps it was an improbable statistical coincidence. Perhaps something happened behind the scenes that never fully came to light. The complete truth if there is such a thing as a single version, may not be as accessible as we would like. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's an aspect that almost no one discusses in depth: the lasting psychological impact of this play on the players involved and the community as a whole. How did this episode influence future decisions? How did you alter the mindset of those at that table? And what invisible marks remained after the broadcast lights went out? Write this down. The line is too thin. If you've made it this far, it's because this story really resonated with you in some way. And that says a lot, because it's not just about a suspicious play or an improbable decision. It's about understanding what goes on behind the scenes, questioning narratives, and seeing poker beyond the cards dealt on the table. This type of conversation, deeper and more investigative, only makes sense when there are people on the other side who also like to think, analyze, and go beyond the surface. So, if this content gave you a new perspective, or at least made you reflect for a few minutes, consider subscribing to the channel. The idea here is to continue exploring exactly this type of story: controversial decisions, little discussed behind-the-scenes details, revelations that change the way we see the game. And so I know you really made it to the end of this journey with me. Write this in the comments. I'm with you until the end. It's almost like a silent code among those who don't consume content superficially, but like to understand what's behind it. If at any point you thought this line is too thin to ignore, leave a like on the video. Not as an obligation, but as a sign that this conversation made sense to you. This shows that it's worthwhile to continue bringing analyses at this level of depth. And since the discussion doesn't end here, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this idea. Another story that also divides opinions and shows how, in poker, the truth isn't always as simple as it seems. Click on it and continue with me there, because the deeper we delve, the more interesting this game becomes.